Okay, I think it looks like the signing in has started to level off, so I think we'll go ahead and begin. I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's, at least here in the Boston area, event today. Very special occasion for us. This is the first lecture in the second year of our Philippine lecture series. My name is James Robson, and I am the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. And I'd like to welcome you all to this event sponsored by the Harvard Asia Center. First to thank Tenzin Nodip, who's been helping to organize this. And like I said, this is the first lecture in our in the second year of the Philippine lecture series, which began last year with 6 excellent talks. And we've chosen to remain virtual for the time being, despite many of us, I think, recognizing the value of being able to gather in person for events. But one of the virtues of doing this is that we can engage with speakers from far away, and also let people sign in from all around the world to attend these talks. And I know that today's event has people signing in from the Philippines and other places far afield. We may shift to a hybrid format eventually, but we'll probably try to keep both options open so we can have the benefits of both of these. So what an extraordinary time for this talk. This is, in fact, the scheduling of this was somewhat deliberate, but also coincided, even though it's not widely covered in the United States press. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is currently on a trip to the United States as the president of the Republic of the Philippines, and he's traveled to New York to attend the United States General Assembly, which he addressed on Tuesday. And I think this was the first time a Philippine leader had done so in nearly a decade. So that was an important event. During this time, he's also meeting with business leaders and American firms, trying to, I think, work on investment in the Philippines and things like that. And we'll be departing back to the Philippines tomorrow, September 23rd. And of course, it was 50 years ago, almost to the day, in fact, on September 21st, 1972, that his father, Ferdinand Marcos, issued Presidential Proclamation number 1081 that declared martial law, imposing this dictatorship on the Philippines that lasted for nearly 15 years until Marcos was exiled from the country on February 25th of 1986. So today's talk will deal with these extraordinary events and their histories and the political crisis that culminated in the Declaration 1081, and we'll also examine some of its historical and contemporary significance. As you know, in May of 2022, Marcos's son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., was elected president of the Philippines, and today's speaker will be asking some questions about how the perpetrators and representatives of dictatorship have been rehabilitated and what we can learn of the martial law regime of the 1970s to aid in understanding the current government. So our speaker today, which we are very fortunate to have, is Joseph Scalice, who most recently was a visiting fellow at the Saucy Hawk Southeast Asia Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he studies revolutionary movements and authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, primarily with a focus on post-war Philippines. He completed his PhD in South and Southeast Asian Studies at UC Berkeley in 2018, and he's also the author of a forthcoming book, very perfectly timed book, I should say, entitled The Drama of Dictatorship, Martial Law and the Communist Parties of the Philippines, which will be coming out from Cornell University Press in 2023. So please join me in welcoming Joseph Scalice, and the title of his talk today is The Imposition of Dictatorship, 50 years since Marcos's declaration of martial law in the Philippines. And now I will turn it over to you, Joseph. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James, and thanks everyone for coming. Give me 1 second here while I share my screen so everyone can view my slides. And if I could just get confirmation from you, James, that those are now visible.
Yes.
Great.
Looks great.
As James mentioned, the title of my talk is The Imposition of Dictatorship, 50 Years Since Marcos' Declaration of Martial Law in the Philippines. Today marks rather precisely the 50th anniversary, half a century of a great crime. Marcos' Declaration of Martial Law wasn't an act of one day, but really extended from September 21 to September 23. The declaration was backdated to the 21st. Marcos had a superstitious predilection for the number 7 and multiples thereof. And it was also to cover all of the actions that he had taken over the space of 48 hours. But the declaration was made on September the 22nd and fully implemented on the 23rd. It was on the morning of the 23rd, as the population awoke to find on the radio stations nothing but static, on the television stations nothing broadcast, and no morning papers, that a realization dawned that something truly drastic had happened. Martial law had been imposed. It was that afternoon that Blas Ople and Ferdinand Marcos himself announced the imposition of military dictatorship. Military dictatorship was, as I said, an immense crime against the Filipino people. 70,000 people were arrested without warrant using the power of martial law. Tens of thousands were tortured in prisons. Over 3,000 are the official death toll, those killed by the martial law dictatorship. Many more were murdered in an act that became known as salvaging, a new word in Philippine English, derived from the Spanish word salvaje. These were those who were picked up by military or paramilitary forces, tortured, murdered, and their corpses thrown into the grassy fields that surround Manila or the rice fields of the provinces. This became a way of life over the course of 15 years. What I want to do in this talk is examine how martial law was imposed, re-examining many of the conceptions that are widespread, both popularly and in scholarship, about the nature of military dictatorship in the Philippines, its function, and its author, Ferdinand Marcos. As James mentioned, I am the author of a forthcoming book, The Drama of Dictatorship, Martial Law, and the Communist Parties of the Philippines. The book is the product of about 10 years of work. It started with Fulbright Fellowship, field work, archival work, and a great deal of writing. I've lived with this subject for a long time, and it's a real honor for me to be able to speak on the anniversary of the Declaration about its significance. I'm going to be structuring my talk today in 5 parts, some short, some long. I want to deal with my sources for this, as well as the fundamental arguments about martial law that have been made and my counter arguments about it. 2, the decisive setting, I argue, is critical for understanding military dictatorship in the Philippines, and that is the setting of global crisis and social unrest. 3, the actors who were involved, and here I'm building upon the language of drama and so on, the dramatis personae, in particular rival factions of the Philippine ruling elite, old and new money, and rival communist parties, the CPP, Communist Party of the Philippines, and the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, or PKP, 2 rival Stalinist parties. And I will explain what I mean by that term. Then, in very abbreviated form, I will go through the drama itself, that is to say, the 2 years leading up to the imposition of martial law. And finally, and somewhat as an epilogue, but nonetheless important, how is it possible that the authors of this crime, many of the beneficiaries of what I am terming a great social crime, have been rehabilitated, so much so that Ferdinand Marcos' namesake, his son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has been elected president of the Philippines. And martial law is being openly proclaimed a golden age in Philippine history. Let's start with my sources and arguments. I'd like to open with 2 rival popular narratives, both false, although not equally false. One is that martial law was a golden age of peace and prosperity, imposed by Marcos to prevent the victory of communism. This narrative has always been in existence among pro-Marcos forces, but it was somewhat of a minority view. It has been brought to the fore on social media, championed by the representatives of Marcos and the falsifiers of the past, claiming that martial law was the greatest age in Philippine history and should therefore be brought back. A rival popular narrative is this: martial law was Marcos' evil plot to stay in power near the end of his 2nd term, which he used to carry out theft on an unprecedented scale. Marcos was nearing the end of his term in office. He could not run for a 3rd term of election, and thus, with cleverness and cunning, he imposed military dictatorship as part of his personal scheme of enrichment and perpetuation of power. I argue that this individual narrative, the bad great man narrative, is equally false. There are grains of truth to both of these. Martial law was a golden age for certain social layers. for a social minority in the Philippines. Marcos did carry out theft on an unprecedented scale, but neither of these narratives can in any way explain in a satisfying fashion how martial law was imposed. My central source in uncovering the history of this period is a wonderful archival collection housed at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, the flagship university of the State University of the Philippines. And these are the radical papers collected from a variety of radical organizations, two rival communist parties, front organizations that followed their political line, anarchist groupings, far-right groups, all sorts of organizations, all producing leaflets and pamphlets and manifestos on a nearly daily basis in the heady intellectual and social ferment that stretched from 1967 to 1972. These were secretly housed at the university library. They weathered the storm of martial law and were brought into public eye with the ouster of Ferdinand Marcos. They were subsequently turned into microfilm by Cornell University. I went through these, digitized every relevant document, broke them down into their component parts, arranged them on a timeline, reconstructing the date for much of this material by reading them in conjunction with 6 major daily papers that I read on a daily basis over the course of many years. This is why my project took me so long. Out of this, I came up with what I argue is a fundamentally new understanding of martial law. I would like to counterpose it to 2 important scholarly accounts that I am revising. The first is a wonderful book by Al McCoy called Policing America's Empire, in which he has this formulation. In declaring martial law, the president would ask the Filipino people to trade their democracy for stability. By their silence and compliance, the majority would tacitly accept his Faustian bargain. Now, McCoy is fundamentally right that silence greeted the declaration of martial law. It is a stunning thing. Reading through the archives is truly, it's a nerve-wracking experience as you read towards September 22, 1972. There are so many daily and weekly papers in circulation, and then suddenly there's abrupt silence. People were protesting on September 21. 70,000 people gathered in Plaza Miranda in the center of Manila to protest the possibility of the imposition of martial law. But one day later, when it was imposed, there was silence. Why is that possible? Here's my first argument in response to McCoy. Far from expressing a Faustian bargain made by, quote, the majority, silence greeted martial law because the elite opposition to Marcos embraced the dictatorship. Mass opposition had been channeled behind rival factions of the elite by rival communist parties. When the elite endorsed martial law, the mass opposition was disoriented and dissipated. This is my first and fundamental revision. The elite opposition to Marcos were not defenders of democracy. They themselves aspired to military rule. They were defeated in this by Marcos, who took power. This and the channeling of opposition behind these forces accounts for the silence. The second scholarly point that I'm responding to is from a very influential and wonderful essay called Cacique Democracy by Benedict Anderson. And in this, Anderson asserts the stability of the system and the solidarity of the oligarchy depended on the Congress, which offered roughly equal room at the top for all the competing provincial dynasties. The one-man office of president was not, however, divisible and came to seem in the era of independence a unique prize. The shrewder, older oligarchs had foreseen possible trouble and had borrowed from the United States the legal provision that no president could serve for more than 2 terms, so that the office could sedately circulate within the charmed circle. But it was only a matter of time before someone would break the rules and try to set himself up as supreme cacique for life, representative of the landed elite, insinuating himself as the permanent ruler. Argument 2, responding to Anderson. The martial law regime was not simply a matter of time and of an individual plotting to become cacique for life. There was universal agreement in the elite by 1970 that dictatorship was necessary. The fundamental function of dictatorship was not the perpetuation of an individual in power, but the suppression of mass unrest in a time of upheaval. It had a class, not a personal function. And thus, while martial law certainly did serve the personal interests of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, perpetuating them in power, facilitating the theft of literally billions of dollars, this was not its fundamental social function. Martial law was possible because it has a social role, the suppression of upheaval. It was agreed upon by every section of the ruling elite. Here then, in bullet points, are my arguments about the nature of martial law. First, it was rooted in a global social crisis. Martial law in the Philippines was an expression of a consensus emerging among ruling elites and the capitalist class around the globe that authoritarian forms of rule were necessary in a context of unrest and upheaval. Two, it was made possible by Washington. It was not simply, as prior accounts have claimed, that Washington was somewhat taken aback by Marcos's declaration of martial law, but in the interests of preserving their military bases and economic ties, agreed to go along with Marcos's dictatorial regime. While certainly the United States sought to preserve its bases and economic relations, reality is far more sinister. The law allowing the declaration of martial law had been written into the Philippine Constitution by the United States during its colonial rule. Washington indicated repeatedly to Marcos prior to the declaration of martial law that they would back his declaration. Richard Nixon in January of 1971 sent a top secret memo to Ferdinand Marcos saying that he would back the declaration of martial law and to the hilt, that's a quote, in the event that Marcos imposed military dictatorship. This then is the character of Washington's facilitating military dictatorship. Three, martial law was mutually agreed upon by the ruling elite, a point that I'll come back to momentarily. But there was not a faction of the elite that were committed to the defense of democracy. Washington had termed the Philippines the showcase of democracy in Asia, but it was boarded up by Washington itself and by their political representatives, the ruling elite in the Philippines. And finally, martial law was facilitated by two rival communist parties. Why there were two parties and what role they played, I will get to in a moment. Let's turn to the setting. Social unrest was growing around the globe. This was bound up with economic crisis as well as with America's war in Vietnam, which provoked a great deal of opposition. Marshall Wright of the National Security Council wrote to Walt Rostow, National Security Advisor, in a top secret memo, August 1967, the following. It would be nearly impossible to overestimate the gravity of the problems with which our next ambassador to Manila must deal. It has become commonplace for people knowledgeable on the Philippines to predict a vast social upheaval in the near future. There is widespread talk that the current president will be the last popularly elected Philippine chief executive. Many high-level American officials consider the Philippines to be the most serious and the most bleak threat that we face in Asia. Now, this is an extraordinary statement. Think of the context of 1967, the war in Vietnam, China is in the grip of the Cultural Revolution, and yet the National Security Council's assessment is that the Philippines constitutes the most bleak threat to U.S. interests in Asia. This is about U.S. economic interests. It's about a former colony going astray. It's about jeopardizing America's bases, which were the nerve center of empire in Asia. But it is about fundamentally the growth of social unrest. They sensed its rumblings. It was coming. It exploded in 1970. It was in this context of social unrest, not simply in the Philippines, but around the world, protest movements, working class struggles. The working class in France shut the country down in the general strike of 1968. In this context, the ruling elite began to turn to authoritarian forms of rule as their preferred form of governance. Suharto in 1965 to 66, Marcos in 1971 to 72, Pinochet, and others. There is a common geopolitical and social interconnection between these figures. Any attempt to understand martial law in the Philippines in a purely national framework is a bankrupt endeavor, I would argue. It must account for why there was this shared affinity for authoritarianism in the ruling elite. And it wasn't simply that they occurred in a concomitant fashion, they were interconnected. Suharto traveled to the Philippines on February 14, 1972, Valentine's Day, to secretly meet with Ferdinand Marcos and instruct him on how best to impose military rule. Who were the actors in this global drama played out in the Philippines? There was agreement, and this is a point that I will substantiate as I play out the drama itself, within the ruling elite in the need for military dictatorship. But this agreement did not mean that there was agreement on who should exercise authoritarian rule. Social crisis jeopardized their class position uniformly. And yet, to place one man or one clique in office permanently would jeopardize the class and economic interests of those excluded from power. And thus, there was a mad scramble to be in power prior to the imposition of dictatorship. Social crisis sharpened, and political crisis followed suit. We witness similar things today. The divisions within the Philippine elite were largely those between old and new money, the landed aristocracy, the sugar barons, the coffee barons, connections to US imperialism and Spanish colonialism, the dons and doñas of the haciendas, and new money, the aspiring industrialist concerns and so on, connected to the global capitalist markets with their own political representative. The foremost representative of new money in the Philippines at this point was Ferdinand Marcos, the son of a provincial lawyer, largely a self-made man of immense political talent. He was the representative of the nouveau riche. The tensions between these factions had not yet emerged in 1969, and thus Marcos's vice presidential candidate, Fernando Lopez, was the foremost representative of old money, the sugar dynasty. I wrote in my book, the Marcoses remained outsiders to the Onshon. Ambition in both Ferdinand and Imelda overflowed into rapacity. They would secure a fortune by theft and a reputation by fraud. The fabled excesses of their dictatorship were imitative, a performative establishment of their superiority to the elite that had excluded them. It lacked refinement, had a tendency to the gauche, but it succeeded in conveying its intent, the apotheosis of the nouveau. In the end, Marcos's victory within the ruling elite and imposition of martial law represented, one, the class tendency of the entire ruling class to suppress unrest, and two, the victory, temporary at any rate, of new money over old. These were the interests that surrounded Marcos. It is thus, and here I am extending my metaphor of drama, that we see a section of the Philippine ruling elite become what I am terming the conspiring understudies in the drama of dictatorship. Marcos was the lead role. It was he, if dictatorship was to be imposed, who would become dictator. He was the re-elected president. He had received immense support in 1965 when he ran for president with the slogan that he would make the Philippines great again. He received overwhelming support for re-election in 1969. He was the man to become dictator. But there were forces in the opposition that while they did not oppose dictatorship, they were opposed to Marcos. And they sought by subterfuge, by assassination attempts, by funding the protests in the street, and by coup plots to remove Marcos and install themselves as dictator. They did not all participate equally in each of these schemes, some more, some less. Osmania, for example, hired American mafia members as an attempt to assassinate Ferdinand Marcos. Aquino and Lopez bankrolled the opposition in the streets. But these were the conspiring understudies. They were not democratic forces, but they were anti-Marcos forces. The question that occupies a great deal of my book and that I can only touch upon here is why is it then that each of these rival factions, Marcos on the one hand and the conspiring understudies of Aquino and company on the other, each received the backing of a communist party. To understand this, we must at least briefly examine what Stalinism is. I am arguing that Stalinism was a political program characterized by three fundamental points: socialism in one country, a two-stage revolution, and the block of four classes. I'll explain the illustration in a moment. Stalinism, I argue, expressed the political interests of privileged layers of the party bureaucracy within the Soviet Union and after 1949 in China. Seeking to defend and expand the social basis of their positions, the bureaucrats put forward a nationalist program of building socialism in one country as the paramount political task, rather than world socialist revolution. This is, I argue, a betrayal of Marxism. Looking to secure diplomatic and trade relations in service to the construction of their national economies, Stalinist bureaucrats sought political capital with which to negotiate with the ruling class in countries around the world. To this end, they rehabilitated the old Menshevik line of a two-state revolution. They instructed communist parties around the globe that the tasks of the revolution in which they were engaged were not yet socialist in character, but national and democratic only. A section of the capitalist class, they argued, would therefore play a progressive role in this necessary first stage of the revolution. These were the allies to which workers and peasants should seek out. The goal of Communist Party leaders should thus be to secure an alliance with this progressive section of the national bourgeoisie and to bring the pressure and support of a mass movement behind their allies. Now, this program found a great deal of enthusiasm within certain social layers around the globe. The global strength of Stalinism rested on the appeal to a layer of nationalist intellectuals in countries of belated capitalist development of its key concepts: socialism in one country, a two-stage revolution, and a block of four classes. The four classes being the working class, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. And here I'll pause. You can see this in the illustration. This is an illustration taken from the manual on drawing from the Communist Party of the Philippines, Drawing Tulong sa Pagtuturo. And you can see mga kaaway, the enemies, and you see it up top, Uncle Sam, the imperialist United States, the comprador bourgeoisie, that is to say the section of the capitalist class allied to imperialism, and Panginoong May Lupa, the landlord. But at the bottom, the four, mga kaibigan, the friends, we have the worker, the peasant, the petty bourgeois, and the national bourgeois. And the difference between the national bourgeoisie and the comprador bourgeoisie has to do with their supposed relation to the national economy and international capitalism. So these were the social layers drawn to the program of Stalinism, which was fundamentally about taking the working class movement and tying it to the national bourgeoisie, to a section of the capitalist class. One more point should be made on this, however, and that is international Stalinism at this period was fundamentally divided. It was at war with itself. By 1969, it had become a shooting war between China and the Soviet Union in the region of Xinjiang and elsewhere. And the global Sino-Soviet split tore apart the Communist Party of the Philippines into two rival parties. The Soviet Union and China, both committed to the construction of socialism within their own borders, never merged their economies. Their divergent national interests inevitably conflicted, giving rise to rivalry, then open split and armed conflict. The uneven economic development of the two countries and their starkly different geopolitical circumstances fueled tensions. Situated behind the buffer zone of Eastern Europe and with a fairly stable industrial base, the Soviet Union followed a policy of peaceful coexistence with the United States and established friendly ties with autocrats. When Suharto imposed dictatorship in Indonesia, the Soviet Union, by the end of 1966, had established formal and friendly relations with the newly installed dictator. China, in contrast, found itself by the mid-1960s threatened on all sides, facing an imminent threat posed by the US invasion of Vietnam and the loss of its largest international ally, the Partai Komunis Indonesia, the PKI, or Indonesian Communist Party, after the military coup in 1965 of General Suharto. The Chinese Communist Party sought to whip up armed struggle throughout the region to defuse the threat of US imperialism from China's immense, imperiled borders. While the Soviet government embraced Suharto, the CCP promoted protracted people's war and armed uprisings throughout the countryside of the world. Now, this line being promoted by Mao and the Chinese Communist Party in this period was not in opposition to an alliance with the capitalist class, but it had a different political capital. It used the radical cachet of cultural revolution and protracted people's war to secure hold over a mass movement in a time of social upheaval, and then channel it behind the interests of the coup-plotting sections of the bourgeoisie, the conspiring understudies. This brings me to my third argument. It was social tensions that tore through the contradiction at the heart of Stalinism, which simultaneously sought an alliance with a section of the elite and hold over the mass movement. And it was this that split the Communist Party of the Philippines in two. The political line of Moscow and the PKP found alignment with the interests of Marcos, and the political line of Beijing in the CPP with those of the conspiring understudies. The PKP, before it split, had backed Marcos in 1965. They had friendly relations with him. Marcos was in office with the blessing and friendly relations, albeit secret, of a communist party. The CPP by 1969 formed an alliance with the Liberal Party and the opposition to Marcos. How then did this play out? All of this came to a head in 1969 when Ferdinand Marcos became the first re-elected president in post-war Philippine history. His rival, Sergio Osmeña, became one of those I am terming the conspiring understudies. Here we see them from earlier in 1969, prior to the economic crisis that set in motion the social crisis of the 1970s, much friendlier times, smiling at each other. Sergio Osmeña famously remarked, "We were outgunned, outgooned, and outgoaled." It is a witty remark, but it must be said that it was not for want of trying. Osmeña spent a sum to purchase Malacanang Presidential Palace, and so did Marcos. Marcos did not win because he outspent Osmeña, but because in the end he was able to posture as the candidate of opposition. Osmeña denounced Marcos for being anti-American and pro-communist, and in a time of growing social unrest, this gave Marcos a certain cachet as a progressive figure, and this secured a good deal of support for him, particularly among the youth. Economic crisis, however, set in at the same time. The Philippines entered the 1970s, like much of the rest of the world, in the grip of an economic crisis. The crisis first manifested itself in the country's plummeting dollar reserves in June of 1969. By August, the peso was exchanging in the black market at a rate of 4.84 to the dollar, while the official rate was 3.91. This continued over the course of 1969. By August 18, the Manila Bulletin ran a headline, "Dive, dive, dive." The peso had reached 5.50 to 1. Inflation skyrocketed. The price of consumer goods more than doubled as the economic crisis combined with a rice shortage in the latter half of 1969. By the end of the year, the Philippines had a balance of payments deficit of $137 million. And by February 1970, the country was confronting the worst economic crisis it had seen in decades. On February 21, 1970, Marcos floated the peso. It devalued in a single day by 50%. The cost of imports shot upward. As a result of devaluation, by 1971, nearly half the population, about 16 million people, were not earning enough to buy their minimum food needs. Consumer prices rose by 32% by the end of 1971. It was this that produced the social and then the political explosion that culminated in the declaration of martial law. When half the population is not earning enough to buy its minimum food needs, an explosion of unrest is imminent. This found expression from January to March of 1970 in an event known as the First Quarter Storm, a series of protests concentrated among students and youth, but dragging in as well workers and peasants from the countryside. These protests were first tens and then as many as 70,000 people marching in the street. They were accosted and beaten by the police, fired upon, some were killed, and each repression of the protests saw the protest movement grow. It was the opening of a decade of unrest and increasing repression. In this context, the conspiring layers looking to remove Marcos, but also looking to impose dictatorship, bankrolled this unrest, bringing behind it their influence. The publications of the front organizations and allied groupings following the political line of the CPP, the Beijing-oriented party, had extremely radical rhetoric. Images of guns, political power flows from the barrel of a gun, and so on and so forth, all of the radical cachet of Maoism in the heady days of Cultural Revolution in the Red Book. But the publications were funded by the bourgeois opposition to Marcos. They had daily access to radio broadcast, weekly access to television broadcast. Their newspapers had funding, as did members of their leadership. Some of their leaders were even on the staff of the opposition, the elite opposition to Marcos. I will proceed very rapidly through the developments of this period. A new explosion of unrest emerged in January and February of 1971. There was widespread speculation that Marcos would impose martial law. It was at this juncture that Nixon advised Marcos that he would back him to the hilt if he did so. Barricades were erected throughout Manila, and in this context, an event known as the Diliman Commune took place, in which students seized control of the flagship campus of the State University in defiance of the state and the police. In August of 1971, 3 grenades were thrown on stage at the Plaza Miranda rally of the Liberal Party opposition to Marcos that was announcing its slate for the midterm election, killing 9 people and wounding many of the candidates of the Liberal Party. Marcos used this as a pretext for suspending the writ of habeas corpus. I have argued elsewhere and cannot go into it here that the evidence of history now overwhelmingly suggests that the Communist Party of the Philippines, despite being allied to the Liberal Party, was responsible for this bombing, seeing it as a means of facilitating repression, which they argued would hasten revolution. Marcos suspended the writ of habeas corpus, rounding up radicals, but not yet his elite opponents. Election marches were set upon by Marcos's goons, thugs who were armed by his allies in the different mayoralties of Metro Manila. Students and youth were beaten to death. Here we see the disturbing image of a 9-year-old boy murdered by Marcos's thugs. The 1971 election was a decisive repudiation of Ferdinand Marcos. The midterm election saw an overwhelming majority of the Liberal Party politicos, who were openly backed by all the front organizations of the CPP and enthusiastically campaigned for, win election. Marcos responded by calling for national unity, and his elite opponents welcomed this. And thus, as 1972 opened, the year of dictatorship, there was quiet that reigned from about January to July. Marcos, meanwhile, quietly set in motion all of the justifications and mechanisms of dictatorship. He had a book, Ghost Written, that came out in December of 71, Today's Revolution Democracy. One of the members or fellow travelers of the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, who were still secretly allied with and supporting Marcos, ghost wrote this volume, in which Ferdinand Marcos made the following extraordinary claim. To Lenin, we owe the statement that there could not be revolution without a revolutionary theory. Lenin conceived of the revolution in 2 steps, first the bourgeois, then the proletarian. Marcos was claiming that he was carrying out the first stage of this revolution, advocated, he claimed, by Lenin, when in fact it was Stalin's change to Marxist theory. But he was claiming he was carrying out the democratic revolution, a revolution from the center, a revolution that would impinge upon the landed holdings of his rivals, but would at the same time use, he openly declared, dictatorial means to suppress unrest. The PKP wrote the justification for this. They did more than write the justification. The PKP secretly staged, in conjunction with Marcos's military, a series of bombings throughout Metro Manila, Joe's department store, Arca, and elsewhere. The Meralco building, the electric distribution facility. They left behind leaflets claiming responsibility for this. Pagsalakay sa Arca, tagumpay ng armadong pakikibaka, or armadong propaganda. These were the claims that they were responsible for a triumph of armed propaganda. Marcos blamed the CPP, despite this. The pretexts for martial law were being established by his allies in the PKP, but Marcos claimed that dictatorship was necessary to prevent communism. The CPP, meanwhile, attempted to smuggle arms into the country from China. Mao was reluctant to send arms to the Philippines, but the ties to the Philippine Communist Party had not yet been fully broken. He provided them with arms. The arms were intercepted by the Philippine military, and Marcos, at the tail end of July, early August 1972, trumpeted this as a further justification for the imposition of dictatorship. The shipping of arms on the Karagatan ship was a debacle for the CPP. Everything came to a head in September of 1972. It was openly discussed. Everyone knew martial law was about to be imposed. Reading through the newspapers of this period is an extraordinary thing. Everyone is saying there are but days remaining before dictatorship. It is not a surprise. No one was surprised by it, shocking as it was. Aquino went to the US Embassy on September 12, 1972, because he was intending to attempt to take power. He was attempting to take power. He openly told the political officers of the US Embassy, we now know from declassified material, with the support of a section of the military and the Communist Party of the Philippines, the pro-Beijing wing. He knew, of course, that Washington would look askance on the seizure of power in alliance with the Communist Party, and thus he reassured the United States that he intended to impose dictatorship. Aquino told the embassy this: the growing threat from the dissidents, the worsening law and order problem were cited by Aquino as reasons why stronger government action is necessary. Such action means martial law. Were he president, Aquino indicated that he would not hesitate to take such strong action and would, for example, execute several corrupt officials at the Luneta Plaza in Manila as a lesson to other officials that he meant business. Aquino is declaring martial law is necessary and I will carry it out. But as one of the conspiring understudies, he needed to take power first. Everything is coming down to this moment. The final act occurred on September 22, 1972. One other scoundrel must here be introduced, a man named Juan Ponce Enrile. He's still alive in his late 90s. He's a man whose entire protracted existence has been dedicated to the principles of dictatorship. In 1952, he published an article in the Philippine Law Journal explaining the justifications for military rule. 20 years later, he staged an attack on his own motorcade as Marcos's defense secretary, claiming that it was carried out by the Communist Party as a final justification for the imposition of martial law. We know that he staged this because when he was responsible in part for the ouster of Marcos in February of 1986, he told the New York Times that this was an action that he had staged. He has subsequently attempted to retract this retraction and claims that that is a lie that he carried this out. He's a liar to his core, but the historical record is clear. Enrile was responsible for this final justification for military dictatorship. And it was thus that democracy died. Marcos issued Proclamation 1081, September 22, 1972, backdating it to the 21st, and using its powers, shut down newspapers, radio, television, carried out mass arrests, both of students and workers and of some of his elite rivals. He placed a ban on all strikes. This was the foremost sign of working class unrest. The strike activity from 70 to 72 had exploded. It had become protracted and, from the perspective of the capitalist class, dangerous. And he padlocked the legislature. All power was now concentrated in the hands of Ferdinand Marcos. Within weeks, he had released almost all of his elite opponents. Within months, he had released all but two, Benigno Aquino and Pepe Jokno, who remained in prison for several years, in the case of Aquino, over the course of most of the decade. Martial law's function, I have argued, was fundamentally a social one. Marcos used martial law not simply to shore up his own personal power, but to suppress the unrest that his elite opponents had feared as well. In the first 5 years of the Marcos dictatorship, 60,000 people were arrested for political reasons. 60,000. These are not the elite opponents of Marcos. 60,000. These are not members of the Communist Party. The numbers don't even come close. These are ordinary people. They are workers. They are students. They are peasants. They are the ordinary people who cannot afford to eat and are coming into conflict with the state. It is these who are being rounded up for political reasons. This is the fundamental function of martial law. They are the victims. They are the ones tortured. They are the ones murdered. They were the ones arrested. And a wide layer of the intelligentsia, including those around the PKP, rushed to welcome martial law. A new publication emerged, Focus Philippines, hailing martial law as emancipation. Miriam Defensor Santiago, a woman with a long political career, declared that Proclamation 1081 and subsequent decrees champion the cause of the poor, correct inequities, and establish climate for law and order, peace, and progress. J.B. Cruz, a very famous journalist, wrote, martial law flushed out the vermin of society. There's a general tone of dignity now. I could come up with quote after quote after quote from figures, many of whom subsequently claimed dishonestly to be opponents of dictatorship. They welcomed it. The Partido Comunista ng Filipinas, the Moscow-oriented PKP, sought to welcome the dictatorship as well. But a section of their youth wing opposed this act and tried to break from the party on these grounds, founding the Marxist-Leninist grouping, MLG. The PKP, eager to enter into Marcos's cabinet with the backing of the Soviet Union, murdered their insubordinate rank and file. I write in my book, while it is difficult to estimate the body count, it is safe to say that significantly more communists were killed by the PKP in the wake of the declaration of martial law than were killed by the dictatorship. They murdered approximately 70, maybe more. The numbers are hard to come by. Many of them shot in their heads in their beds. Having murdered members of their own party, they then drafted a resolution in 1973 welcoming the declaration of martial law. This was the justification. The Philippines is a neo-colonial country of dynamic capitalist development. Its economy is in the main backward and deformed by colonial plunder. Under the hegemony of finance capital, spearheaded by US imperialism, the Philippines is vigorously being transformed from a predominantly feudal country into a modern capitalist economy. Today, it is experiencing a tremendously rapid pace of capitalist buildup through the instrumentality of the martial law dictatorship. Now, this may not sound like an endorsement from a communist party, but it is. The principle of Stalinism was that national democracy needed to be achieved first, functioning capitalism. And under the auspices of US imperialism, through the hegemony of finance capital, and working through the instrumentality of dictatorship, Marcos was doing this. It should be welcomed. The PKP issued this, surrendered their arms, and entered Marcos's cabinet. They became members of foreign affairs, of military intelligence, and of the Labor Bureau. They traveled and arranged friendly ties with Eastern Europe and with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Jose Maria Sison, head of the Communist Party of the Philippines oriented to Beijing, issued the following assessment in the flagship publication of the party, Ang Bayan. We consider the present situation far more favorable to the revolutionary movement than ever before. The more the fascist dictatorship madly goes after all kinds of workers' organizations, the more it will aggravate its already isolated position. The more workers' rights are suppressed, the more will the workers become fearless of the US Marcos dictatorship. The violent suppression of workers' unions and strikes can only yield more determined fighters for the revolutionary cause. Dictatorship hastens revolution. The more workers are suppressed, the more they will rise up. This was their political line. He continued, the party should win over members of the national bourgeoisie in the cities and in the countryside to give political and material support, that means money and arms, to the revolutionary movement. Since they themselves cannot be expected to bear arms against the enemy, we don't call on capitalists to bear arms, that's the task of the workers. They can extend to the revolutionary movement support in cash or in kind, or allow use of their facilities. The party should protect their legitimate interests against the wanton assaults of US imperialism and the puppet dictatorship. The national bourgeoisie can join the anti-imperialist and anti-fascist united front and will be amply represented in the national coalition government to be set up in the future. Give us money and aid, we will protect your interests and ensure that you're part of a future government. This was the line of the CPP, and quiet reigned in the streets of Manila. Mao, meanwhile, went a very different way. Confronting the alarming growth of conflict with the Soviet Union, Mao sought out ties with Kissinger and Nixon. Ping-pong diplomacy led to open ties, and in this context, the open embrace of the autocrats and dictators who were gathered around Washington when Pinochet overthrew Allende and crushed the Chilean Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party established friendly relations with Pinochet. In like manner, the Communist Party established relations with Marcos. Here is Imelda Marcos traveling to meet Mao in September of 1974. The CPP, under the leadership of Sison, hailed this as a revolutionary victory for revolutionary diplomacy of China. Allow me to sum up my arguments about dictatorship before I briefly turn to the question of its rehabilitation. First, it had a social function, the suppression of the working class and of unrest more generally. Second, it was a national manifestation of a global phenomenon, the global context of authoritarianism. Third, Stalinism is fundamentally a political program. Maoism is a variant of Stalinism. And it was the alignment of Stalinism with rival factions of the elite that derailed a mass movement and made martial law possible. Now, as I have remarked, this was an immense crime. Marcos was ousted in a mass movement of courageous defiance in February 1986. Millions of people gathered on Edsa Avenue, what became known as People Power, or the Edsa Revolution. This was a point of great national pride. How is it then that the architects of dictatorship and its beneficiaries have been rehabilitated and martial law is widely declared to be a golden era in Philippine history? In the conclusion to my book, The Drama of Dictatorship, I wrote, "Shades of the present haunt every work of history, but in few instances is their presence as palpable as this one. The drama is being restaged." Here we have Ferdinand Marcos Jr. The words of Karl Marx in the 18th Brumaire seem particularly apt. Hegel remarks somewhere that all facts and personages of great importance in world history occur, as it were, twice. He forgot to add, the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. Marcos Jr. is Louis Napoleon to his father's Bonaparte. He is an unimpressive man, possessed at best of an artful stupidity. He is the child of unfathomable privilege. College dropout, business school dropout, pampered and predatory. He struggles to complete a coherent sentence, and throughout his presidential campaign, he avoided debates to hide precisely this fact. And yet, he has succeeded in becoming president. His father was an incredibly eloquent and clever man. Marcos Jr. is not, but he bears his father's name, and he represents unabashedly the rehabilitation of martial law. This is not the family's dirty secret. It is its calling card. It is on this basis that he was elected, claiming that this was the golden age. How is that possible? Corazon Aquino took office in 1986 as the Marcoses took up exile in Hawaii, the beneficiary of unprecedented levels of mass hope. After a decade and a half of repression, everything would be different now. Little changed. Her people power government, which spoke incessantly of democracy, proved to be the rule of a rival set of oligarchs. It was in this political climate in which everything changed, but nothing was different, that shaped education about the martial law regime. To detail the crimes of the dictatorship would have exposed many of the allies and policies of the Aquino government. And thus the textbooks did not speak of the crimes of the dictatorship, but merely of the excesses of the Marcos couple. Imelda is not known for her brutality, but for her thousands of pairs of shoes. The injunction never again was widely repeated, but the predicate to which it was attached became hazy and ill-remembered. Each successive administration inherited diminishing popular hopes that the hard-won forms of democracy would produce meaningful reform. They did not. The Aquino government and several subsequent administrations cultivated in popular consciousness a dichotomy. Marcos, corrupt and rapacious, responsible for the country's economic destitution, and liberal democracy, the solution to the country's ills. The passage of time weakened the content, but the formal dichotomy remained, waiting for the day its polarity was reversed. This was the thrust of Ferdinand Jr.'s campaign. Martial law was a golden age, everything that came after a fall from grace. He stood the people-powered dichotomy on its head. Conjoined with this has been the rotting away of democratic liberalism around the globe. This is expressed in the campaigns that do not address the fundamental social ills, but simply appear for civility and decency. The fundamental social ills confronting the population, poverty, wages, prices, have been left without solution. And it is this, his irreversible and world historic abdication, that has ceded to Marcos Jr., like his counterparts around the globe, an objective social basis. The cultivated mass despair at the possibility of a democratic solution to the country's immense social ills. Marcos Jr., like Rodrigo Duterte before him, has his counterparts around the globe. We are witnessing once again, in breathtaking form, a rising tide of authoritarianism. Bolsonaro, Modi, Trump, these are but a smattering. We have the AfD in Germany, etc. Social inequality is so hollowed out that formal equality can no longer sustain itself. The drama is being restaged. Ferdinand Marcos Sr. now has a statue erected in my small hometown of Paniki Tarlac. He stands there with his arms outstretched in victory in the center of civic life, alongside Jose Rizal, Andres Bonifacio, and Ninoy Aquino. Allow me to conclude by quoting a passage from the introduction to my book. I single this out because it both highlights the cause that made dictatorship possible in my argument, but it also, in its lines, includes what might have been, and thus what also yet might be. Like all tragedies, the drama of dictatorship is heavy with fate. The great aims of the age drove forward the interests of the past. For the outcome to be other, masses needed to speak their own lines. They did not. They filled the stage of history, but others spoke in their stead. One reads the words of the Stalinists with a sense of double vision, as the irony between the intended and the said, the contradiction between the interests they articulated and the forces they addressed is felt in even the most superficial of their lines. Titanic social forces were constrained by these lines to act through surrogates whose motives were antithetical to their own. Assigned by history a central role, theirs remained but a chorus subjectivity. This, more than any other factor, determined the denouement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Joseph, for this really interesting walk back through time to the moment in the pre-70s and then the 70s and all the way up to the present. And I think the kind of dismantling you did of the popular narratives to show that these are not, and usually I think this is the case historically, where historical realities are not easily sort of put in these clear oppositional categories, but history is and people are much messier than that. And I think that the way that you clarified that was, I think, very important for us to think about. There's a number of questions that have come in already, and I'll just remind everybody who's in attendance today that you can use the Q&A function on Zoom and type your questions into the Q&A box that will appear for you. I will curate those and give them to Joseph. So please do that. I would like to begin just with one thought that came to me while listening to your really thought-provoking presentation. And it really was the way that, I learned a lot from the way that you were clarifying this issue of the alliances, say, between Marcos and Moscow and the others, or the understudies, I think you called them, and the alliance with China, but then also even the stance that Aquino had towards martial law as well. That was a really striking quotation. What it had me thinking was, is it inevitable, or should one disaggregate martial law and dictatorship? In other words, do these always have to travel together? Could there have been, something different in the sense of that imposition of martial law as addressing the kind of social concerns that were certainly you clearly presented and laid out in very fine detail that were arising at that time. And then just as a kind of a corollary to that then is just, where you ended in terms of this restaging. Is there a fear, or is there a sentiment of possible return of martial law as another part of this drama? Your thoughts on that would be really appreciated as well. So I'll begin there, and then I'll open up to the. Now there's a whole bunch of questions coming in, and so I'll shift over to those. But it was just one thought that occurred to me while you were speaking. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. It's a fascinating question. Martial law is always dictatorial. That is to say, it is the use by the executive of military power to suspend democratic rights temporarily or in permanence to achieve certain ends. The question that must be raised by martial law always is its social content. To what ends is martial law being mobilized? Is it an attempt to restore order in the context of flooding or something like that? Is it necessary in that regard? Is that the justification? Or is it fundamentally an attack on democratic rights and an attempt to consolidate certain class interests? There was no dispute whatsoever in the 1970s that it was the latter, that martial law was a measure intended to, in a state of semi-permanence, shut down democracy in order to prevent the growth of social unrest. Everyone wrote about it in that regard. It was in all the editorials in the major papers and so on. And thus, yes, always dictatorial, but in this case, conceived of as dictatorship. The second half of your question, is there the danger of martial law today? I've written and argued that we're already witnessing a creeping martial law. Both under the Duterte administration and now under Marcos, we have seen an alarming growth in what is called red tagging, accusing various legal activists, human rights figures and so on of being members of the Communist Party, and then using that as a justification for their arrest without warrant under the auspices of anti-terror legislation under an Orwellian organization known as the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or NTF-LCAC. They have been sometimes murdered or shot by police while they were being arrested. A vice presidential candidate, famed man of the international left named Walden Bello, was charged with cyber libel for his own vice presidential campaign and arrested on those grounds. The attack on free speech, on basic rights, is well advanced. And one asks oneself what further steps would need to be taken for martial law to be imposed. But certainly we're witnessing the spread of open attacks on democracy, as well as the cultivation of widespread anti-democratic sentiment among certain social layers. Okay.
And then this is combining some of the questions that sort of lead off of that is, what is the landscape of opposition towards sort of tendencies towards martial law in the Philippines now then? Do you detect that side? Is it beginning to raise its voice or organize and begin to work in that direction? Do you have any sense of that?
There are certainly attempts to organize an opposition, but I would have to say, and I say this with a sense of concern, that the attempts to organize thus far have been fairly weak and have been not anything close to what they were once in the past. This expresses, I think, concern over the level of power that's already been consolidated by the state and the possible implications of opposition. You could wind up killed. It's not unlikely, or it's not implausible. But beyond that, there is, and this must be said, the invalidating of certain political tendencies who followed the same political line as the Stalinist party, the endorsement of a section of the national bourgeoisie, and who openly hailed Rodrigo Duterte in 2016 as a progressive figure, entered into his cabinet. These are the same social forces who would organize ordinarily the opposition to the emergence of Marcos, groups like Bayan and company. I think they've lost a tremendous amount of political credibility as a result of their support for Duterte in 2016. And while they now denounce him, they have not recovered that credibility. And I think that further weakens the opposition to Marcos and the rehabilitation of martial law.
Yeah, and then to condense one of the questions here too, and again, it kind of continues this thread a little bit, which is to say, in your overall argument, I think the description of martial law and the dictatorship as a social problem, then one could also look at the issue of the potential for opposition now as also being a social problem, in the sense that we have a widespread kind of sense of having flipped that narrative, as you said, away from people power to a kind of looking back on martial law period as a golden age period. So in other words, how would those opposition parties or opposition be able to mount an effective movement against these tendencies that might be growing at this point, when there's so much kind of popular, at least opposition to that rhetorically, or probably in fact as well, it seems like, from watching what happened around the election time?
This is a critical question, in my opinion, and is bound up with the fact that what I call the world historical abdication of traditional liberalism. A great constituency that would traditionally vote for the liberal ticket, whether the Democrats in the United States or for the opponents of Marcos in the Philippines or in other countries as well, has been lost precisely because of the inability to address the underlying social issues. This is my argument. And thus, there are portions of the Rust Belt that would traditionally have voted for the Democratic candidate that swung Trump. And thus, in the Philippines, very significant layers that would traditionally have voted for a left candidate, or an ostensibly left candidate, someone who mouthed the language of the left, voted for a right-wing populist and believed the lie of a golden age. It's an act of desperation. I called it the enthusiasm of despair. That said, that does not mean that these forces are in their mass or majority gung-ho supporters of the far right, endorsers of QAnon, or in the Philippines of the reemergence of martial law. They're looking for someone to solve their social ills. Marcos, alone of the candidates running for office, to my knowledge, promised to cut rice prices effectively by half. Now, whether or not he'll pull that off, that sort of promise wins support in the ballot box. And a genuine left opposition, one that addresses the needs of the working class and peasantry, I argue, could swing the situation very rapidly. The social explosion is palpable. It's why authoritarian forms of rule are being rehabilitated. But the alternative to this isn't an adaptation to these forces, but opposition to them, clear and open opposition.
Interesting. The pushing on a slightly different topic, but one I think that is reflected in some of the questions here, or some of them are posed more as comments, but your shift when you talk about this as being restaged, and then also situating this, I think, very effectively as not just a national issue, but these are global, actually global issues that have that we see resonances of in other parts of the world, both then and now. But perhaps hear your thoughts on obviously it's not a recapitulation of that, but what are some of the nuances, say, between the authoritarian populist leaders, the Bolsonaros, the Modis, the Chavezes, the Erdogans, the Orbans of this day? If you were sort of had to come think about these two different time periods and the phenomenon that was happening then and now in terms of the rise of authoritarianism and all of that. Are there some distinctions to be drawn about what do we see today in relationship to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a good many. This is a critical question and merits an extensive answer, but let me just touch on what I think are a couple critical ones. The first is the geopolitical landscape, and thus the political landscape has been transformed. The Soviet Union was dissolved by the Stalinist bureaucracy, the opening of the 1990s, no longer exists. Capitalism was restored in China, although it is still governed by the Chinese Communist Party. This fundamentally alters the landscape, not simply within these countries, but also the network of opposition and so on around the world. The sway of these, I'm calling them Stalinist parties that exercised over the workers' movement has diminished immensely. This leaves workers' movements largely unorganized and bound up to a certain extent in old trade union apparatuses and so on, but to a startling degree, much less unorganized. This gives it, in some ways, a diminished strength, but it also means it has the possibility to move under new leadership in entirely new directions. And I think there's an edge to that. And I think that's sensed by these various figures. The second is the more open endorsement of the language of the very far right. The authoritarian figures of the 1960s and 70s couched themselves in the language of development economics. Marcos presented himself very much as a progressive figure. He established friendly ties with the Soviet Union, and that wasn't simply of a sort of false or predatory character. He had an aspiration to build the national economy of the Philippines in a capitalist fashion, but that was his goal. The language of the authoritarian figures today resembles changing what needs to be changed much more that of Hitler and Mussolini, and in fact draws on it at times. There is a fascist element to what is being said, sometimes openly. There is, for example, the Duterte youth around Rodrigo Duterte, a group of black shirts who are openly modeled on the Hitler youth. And one finds similar forces in the landscape in the United States and elsewhere. And this also, I think, is a fundamental and truly alarming development. It needs to be taken seriously.
Certainly does. And then the question becomes, and this is also reflected in much of the comments that have come in and some of the questions as well, just in terms of how those whose own interests are actually, in terms of the support they're giving to particular leaders and movements actually go against their own interests in many ways, but also have been kind of, one might say, even fooled in terms of lending their support to those movements. Is there something that the left or the opposition parties can learn from the kind of strategies that have been used or at least monopolized by these new populist authoritarian rulers in order to even mount an opposition? Or is it the principle against that should be fought against in terms of propagation of lies, fake news, all of that kind of stuff? It's a tricky, I know, kind of a tricky question there. Which part do you attack, the principle, or do you try to utilize it as a strategy for your own form of organization and opposition?
Again, a critical question. The growth of these forces, the rhetoric they use, the tactics they employ, must be studied carefully, must be examined with extreme care, but not so that their toolbox can be borrowed from and implemented. I would argue rather because we have to understand the social roots of their success and then address those social roots, not by imitating these forces, but precisely by stealing away from them the support that they have pilfered from the working class, that they have stolen. And they've stolen it precisely because of this abdication of forces that ostensibly would have defended democracy and the interests of the working class. A new movement of the working class, I argue, is the fundamental antidote to these problems.
Yeah, it's good. And that also raises a related question then of your role as a historian. Clearly, I think we have this repeated phrase about never forgetting not letting history repeat itself, all these types of things that we're all aware of, and I think energizes historians often. But in the face of these movements that then have revisionist histories or fabricate things about the past, then it puts the historian also in a tricky position then of how to allow that historical narrative to win the day. What are your thoughts on that as somebody who's now coming out with this book that's explicitly aiming to do this?
Yeah, this is such an important question, and in some ways, at times, such a wearying one. One can feel at moments somewhat isolated, but I think that is actually not accurate. In the end, I am convinced that historical truth can win out, that if patiently explained to the broad population, that the evidence, the logic, the fact that it articulates their interests can win out over propaganda. Propaganda has such force both because of the intense backing that it receives, the mechanisms whereby it is presented and so on, but it also wins out precisely because a genuine alternative is not seen. And patient explanation, the stuff of history, the persistent defense of historical truth. I remain convinced that this, and not the telling of new myths, is the only way forward. And I'm committed to it. But it can be slow, difficult work, and you, in the process, will receive all sorts of slanders and death threats. I've gotten my fair share, but nonetheless, needful work.
Okay, maybe we'll shift slightly to a different topic that's come up in some of the questions as well, and that is and I think this is, actually had a talk on this in the series last year in the lead up to the election, because it was such a big issue, but it also then comes up in thinking about your talk and going back to the earlier Father Marcos and the relationship between, or positioning of, the Philippines vis-a-vis China. And this has become a rarefied issue in the, obviously, in our time, in the debates and over the fishing, perhaps, and things like that in the South China Sea, or in all of that. And I just would like to hear your thoughts on that. This seemed to me, for somebody viewing the elections from afar back in May, it was a really difficult issue to try to understand when you see those members of Philippine society who are the low, say, working class fishermen and things like that, voting seemingly against their interest of having the other side supporting China's claims to the South China Sea, which would seem to be voting against their interest. But then I guess from a different perspective, you could also say, well, it's the candidate who is willing to cozy up to China that also would then guarantee them access to that as well. So it's a tricky question, and the Philippines' position vis-a-vis present day China is a tricky one as well. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, just maybe in relationship to the early historical situation, but it may be totally different at this time.
It is a fundamentally different thing, both in terms of the social character of China and in terms of the balancing act that people need to engage in. Allow me to open up with what I think is the fundamental framing for this, which is the so-called special relationship that the Philippines has with the United States. It's mentioned by every U.S. ambassador to the country ad infinitum every time they come to visit or say something, or any speech they give. There's reference to the special relationship. The special relationship is 50 years of colonial rule, drawing up the architecture of post-independence democracy in the Philippines and so on, and then testing out the various techniques that the U.S. used around the globe. Edward Lansdale, who was the architect of the U.S. policy in Vietnam, tested out those policies in the Philippines when he drew up the presidency of Magsaysay. The U.S. has had its hands for a very long time on economics and politics in the Philippines, bases in the country, parity rights in the economy, and so on. And the declining economic hegemony of the United States and the globe, manifested above all by the rising economic power of China, has destabilized the region profoundly. And in few places is that as palpable as in this country with so-called special relations. And thus, for politicians, there is the invariable question of seeking to secure Chinese economic investment and economic ties with China without at the same time endangering political relations with the United States. And this has become, particularly with the Obama administration announcement of the pivot to Asia, the deployment of 2/3 of US military forces to the Asia-Pacific region, the transits of the South China Sea, the transit of the Taiwan Straits, the threat of war over Taiwan with China. It's become unbearable, unsustainable. And memory of the Japanese occupation, of the US presence in the Philippines and the Japanese arrival, precisely because of the US presence in the Philippines, or at least to an extent, and the fact that the Philippines was occupied for 3 years, known as Tatlong Taong Walang Diyos, 3 years without God. It was that brutal. These memories haunt the body politic to this day. And thus the geopolitical conflict between Washington and Beijing playing out across the Philippine landscape creates an unbearable situation and a balancing act. Duterte chose to balance more towards China. Marcos seems to be reversing that. And his visit that you mentioned to New York seems to be a significant step in that regard. But none of these problems will resolve themselves. Every additional ratcheting up of tensions over Taiwan, et cetera, means an additional political tension within the Philippines.
Yeah, and I should also mention there that when I was posing that question, I was obviously raising the question from the perspective of the issues raised by the Chinese, calling it the South China Sea versus the Philippines, yes, calling that the West Philippine Sea. It's an important point to be clear on there, and that actually holds up, I think, under the way that I was trying to represent the interests of those in the Philippines who have the threat of denied access to those areas, yes, to fish. So I would like to. I'll come back to the issue of Marcos Jr.'s recent visit to the UN, but I'd like to first raise a quick question that had come up, and also one that I was curious about hearing about myself, was your discussion of this very intriguing figure. Perhaps that's a kind of a misstatement there, but of Yunli. And what is his role now as vis-a-vis the present Marcos? And if you could say anything more, sounds like he's not the type of person that would sort of disappear into the night.
No. He's something of a political godfather to Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. He's had an extraordinary, and even in the context of Philippine politics, which is quite brutal, a truly rotten history. He was, as I said, the author of an article on how to suspend the writ of habeas corpus as early as 1952. He was, as defense minister, the architect of martial law under Ferdinand Marcos, and then the implementer of martial law. It was he, along with several other figures, that oversaw torture and arrests without warrant on an industrial scale through apparatus of military intelligence. He was personally responsible for overseeing the apparatus of salvaging, etc. The man has blood on his hands, make no mistake. But he became increasingly restive, recognizing, as Marcos ailed in the 1980s, that he felt he was justified in taking over at the head of a military junta, the reins of power, but it became increasingly clear that perhaps Imelda, Marcos's wife, would become the heir apparent. And he thus allied himself to sections of the military known as the Reform the Armed Forces movement, a right-wing movement determined to not establish democracy, but reform the armed forces, ensure proper promotion, undo the ethno-nepotism of Marcos, who was inclined to promote his fellow Ilocanos, and to establish a military junta. It was this, in fact, that precipitated the People Power Revolution of 1986. Yunli saw in the unrest following the disputed elections between Cory Aquino and Ferdinand Marcos, the possibility of seizing power. He took over a military base. This was a military coup, but it, through a complicated thing that I can't entirely go into now, it's a marvelous story, wound up tied to and then subordinated to the mass movement in the streets and became seen as part of people power. It was not. There's not a democratic bone in that man's body. He became defense minister of the Cory Aquino government, attempted to stage a coup called the God Save the Queen coup in late 1986 to attempt to reorient the Aquino administration to the right and get her to remove social democrats from her cabinet. She complied, but she removed Yunli as well. Yunli tied himself to coup plotting sections of the military and staged coup attempt after coup attempt after coup attempt in the late 1980s. I remember I lived through them. The worst of them was in 1989. And then went on to have a political career, culminating in his becoming the president of the Senate. He's now a man in his 90s and serves as political godfather to Ferdinand Marcos Jr. I have no love for this man.
Okay. We only have a few minutes left, and I think I've more or less been able to capture at least, if not the exact details of every question that was raised, and there were too many. There was over 30 of them. I was trying to combine and capture the spirit of some of them, but I think it would be, given that Marcos Jr. is visiting and actually on the East Coast here right now, perhaps end with a few of your thoughts just about the significance or symbolism of this visit, but also the address, if you had a chance to hear it, that was given at the UN on Tuesday. Because the U.S. and also, why is the U.S. press, do you think, just not covering this? I mean, I searched through newspapers. As far as I could tell, there was very little. A few papers put the address to the UN with no comment, no analysis whatsoever. They just let the video speak for itself. So that would be, I think, an appropriate way to end this wonderful conversation with you, Joseph. And thank you again for your talk. Please.
This is a fascinating question, and one that I've been thinking about this week. I mean, there's two reasons why it wasn't raised. Let's start there, and then we'll talk about its significance. On the one hand, I think from the vantage point of Washington, from the State Department, from the Pentagon, which certainly wants, in the form of something known as EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement established under the Aquino administration prior to Duterte, the restoration effectively of American military bases in the Philippines. And for them, the jury's still out. Marcos is not yet decidedly in the camp of Washington, but it's clear that he's stepping away from the camp of Beijing, and thus, to an extent, that informs whether or not there's going to be coverage. Certainly not entirely, but there's an element of, if Washington's excited about something, it winds up in the paper in one way or another. There's an element of that. But I would also point out that Marcos's visit is sandwiched between the funeral of the Queen and Putin saying that he might use nuclear weapons. And as a result, maybe received less attention than it might otherwise receive. We have a world war effectively playing out in Ukraine, and we have the adulation over royalty, and Marcos is lost somewhere in between. What was the significance of Marcos's visit? Make no mistake, this was a significant visit. It was significant for the Marcos family personally, and it was significant for what it represented in terms of America's relations with its past. The United States backed Marcos to the hilt, as they promised, all the way through Ferdinand Marcos Sr., all the way through the 70s. The Nixon administration did so with alacrity, the Carter State Department with some reservations, and Reagan in a way that was unprecedented. Ronald and Nancy Reagan were personal friends with Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. Imelda and Nancy used to compare notes on what their astrologers said about what was going to happen that week. When Marcos was finally ousted, the last person to agree to have him removed from office was Reagan himself. Reagan's entire cabinet turned on Marcos before Reagan personally did. There's this long relationship, and America tried to cover it up when they brought Cory Aquino, the widow whose husband was murdered by the Marcos administration in one fashion or another, to speak before the Joint House of Congress, to establish its ties with democracy in the Philippines and so on. But it did not entirely succeed in this. The Marcoses stole billions of dollars. It's salted away in Switzerland and in New York and so on. They were guilty of immense human rights violations. They had been brought before international courts on these charges. Marcos was not even supposed to be allowed in the United States. His visa was denied on the grounds that he faced human rights charges. I don't recall the precise details, but prior to his election as president, this was a president who was elected who could not travel to the United States. But the US State Department lifted these requirements and allowed him to visit, clearly indicating that those dead and murdered, those stolen from, the majority of Filipinos in one way or another, were less important than relations with Malacanang Presidential Palace. And tragically, and I say this as a scholar who is himself an American citizen, this is a long history of the US and Asia and elsewhere. When Rodrigo Duterte launched his war on drugs in 2016, that turned into a campaign of mass murder. In its early stages, as hundreds of victims were already racked up, John Kerry provided money from the US government to back the war on drugs. It was only when Duterte announced, he called Obama a son of a bitch, and then he announced that he was establishing ties with China, that suddenly the United States started to speak about human rights. Realpolitik, geopolitical interests, trump human rights concerns from the vantage point of the White House, regardless of if it's a Republican or a Democrat in office. And the welcoming of Marcos to New York, his presence at the UN as an elected representative, as the elected leader of the Filipino people, revisiting effectively the scene of the crime. And this is where their wealth was stored away, where Imelda had her penthouses and her shoes. It represents a great reversal. And people should take note. We should draw the historical lessons of this. It should not be allowed to continue to stand. That's my argument. But yes, make no mistake, it was an event of historic significance.
Great, thank you. We're just a little bit over time, and I wish we had more time to chat because there's so many other questions that I was also thinking about looking forward in terms of this presidency of Marcos Jr. But also looking down the line a little bit. One thing I thought that was striking about the recent elections was the success at local level of what's happening politically at the local level vis-a-vis the Marcos family and others that will be something to pay attention to in the future as this drama, as you called it, continues to play out. Unfortunately, we'll have to save those for another day. And before and I should also, many people asked in the question and answer area if there'll be a recording of this, and yes, there will be. We will house it on the Asia Center website and our YouTube channel, and I think that the information was put into the chat for everyone to see about how to access that. And I should also say before we thank our speaker for today that I'd like to invite everyone to join us again for the second talk in the second year of this series, which will be on October 27th. And this will be delivered by Vicente Rafal, the professor at the University of Washington. So please join us. The information for that talk you can find on the Asia Center website under the Philippine Lecture Series. So thank you to everybody who has signed in today for the questions that you have posted for us. And most of all, thank you to Joseph Scalice for this incredibly both timely, informative, and thought-provoking talk that I think all of us have learned a tremendous amount from, and I very much look forward to being able to read your book when it's published and digest some other elements of it slowly as well. But from what you put up on the screen of the excerpts of it, it sounds like a beautifully written book as well. So I look forward to enjoying that when it's out. But thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.